Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good afternoon and welcome to CSIS. I'm Jon Alterman, Senior Vice President, Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy, and Director of the Middle East Program here. I am really delighted to welcome you to a book talk today with my old friend Glenn Robinson, who wrote a book called Global Jihad, A Brief History. Glenn is a professor of defense analysis at the Naval Postgraduate School and is affiliated with the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. He has authored or co-authored 4 books on Middle East politics, and he's written scores of journal articles, book chapters, government reports, and conference papers. He's won awards for his teaching, both at the Naval Postgraduate School and at UC Berkeley. He's also been active in policy work, working closely with both the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Department of Defense on development and political challenges facing the Middle East. Glenn will present on his book. He and I will have a brief discussion, and then we'll open the floor up to questions. If you have a question, on the webpage where you logged on to this talk, there's a button to ask a question to the author. So it's my real pleasure to introduce you to my friend, Professor Glenn Robinson.
Thank you very much, Jon. It's a very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to see you again, even if it's only via digits. And it's a great honor and pleasure to have this opportunity to address the CSIS community on my new book. So let me begin. I'll share a screen in just a moment, but let me just begin by answering the unasked question about why did I write this book? Why, kind of why now? And the answer is, I thought, 20 years after 9/11, 4 decades after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which started the ball rolling on this new phenomenon of global jihad, this was a good time to kind of step back and look at the entire puzzle, put the pieces of the puzzle together in a coherent and rigorous way of how do we understand this phenomenon. We've had time to examine it now. We have a fair amount of literature out there, documentation, et cetera. So this is just, it's a good time to step back and again, think big picture of how do we understand this movement. And as part of that, and this is what I do at the end of the book, we'll get into in just a moment, I ask, so what? Where does this phenomenon fit into the larger universe of violent political movements, primarily non-state violent political movements in recent decades over the last century or so. And so that is why I wrote the book and where kind of what the contents are about. So let me share a screen. I do have a few slides here that for those of you that don't want to listen to me, you can just look at the slides and get the same kind of argument. Incidentally, I just found out literally a half an hour ago, the book is one of Foreign Policy's best books of 2021. So that was a nice honor that I just found out about. All right, so I make 2 broad arguments in the book. And I promise you this, all my other slides have nice pictures and things. One is to look at this phenomenon of global jihad and basically argue that there have been 4 very distinct iterations of global jihad. They're all global jihad. They all see issues as a systemic problem in the global community at the international level, not trying to overthrow a local regime or, recapture a patch of land here or there. But there is a systemic global problem that needs to be addressed and can only be addressed through the use of violent jihad. But they're all quite distinct from each other, right? Different set of crises that launch the movements, different ideological formulations. So they're all under the same umbrella of global jihad, but 4 very distinctive iterations. And so most of the book is going through each of these 4 what I call waves, because waves is a nicer word than iteration, But don't think of sort of nicely spaced out periodic waves, but 4 distinct iterations of global jihad over the last 4 decades. And then the second argument that I make at the end of the book, the kind of the so what, where does this fit into the broader universe of violent cases? I draw on some work that was done briefly by Ken Jowett in the 1990s on movements of rage. And I make the understandably provocative argument that I take his concept and I play with it, and I think hopefully make it more useful. But say that there is a small subset of groups, both secular and sectarian, again, over the last century or so, that are marked not by sort of, in terms of their self-promotion, Enlightenment ideals of science, progress, liberty, or just material progress in the case of elements of fascism, but in fact are marked by nihilistic violence, nihilism in the political sense, so not meaningless violence, but system-destroying violence, and apocalyptic ideology. So end times, end of the world as we know it, but some kind of nirvana around the corner. So we'll get to that in just a minute. So just very briefly on each of these, oops, I skipped one. So I do spend a chapter putting some context in, talking about the rise of Islamism in the 20th century, very much a 20th century movement. Islamism, political Islam, we used to call it Islamic fundamentalism. And the main point that I want to drive home here on that is that violence was sometimes employed by Islamist groups, the Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which was founded in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna at the top of your screen. But violence was not integral to the political project of the Muslim Brotherhood or similar Islamist movements. It would happen sort of tactically from time to time, but it wasn't at the core of what their political project was or is about. I then go into the rise of jihadism, so the intellectual architecture for jihadism being laid, contemporary jihadism being laid in the 1960s, early 70s, in both the Shia and the Sunni worlds, including by a couple of people on your screen, Khomeini in Iran, and Said Qutb, an Egyptian school teacher who was hanged in 1966, essentially for his work in promoting the necessity of violence to overthrow what he referred to as a Jahili or non-Islamic regime in Cairo. And then the third step along the way is the rise of this variant form of jihadism that's focused on global issues, or again, it's systemic global problems. As I suggest, there have been 4 very distinctive iterations of that. So let's just briefly go into each of those 4 waves. The first one is comes out of Afghanistan, comes out of the Soviet invasion and occupation of Afghanistan in the 1980s. But there were some jihadi ideologues, most especially the man you see in front of you, Abdullah Yusuf Azzam, the Imam al-Jihad, as it says, the preacher of jihad, who said, basically concluded as the 1980s rolled on, that Afghanistan is not unique, that the occupation, ihtilal, the occupation of Muslim lands is a common problem that stretches across Africa and all across Asia, to the Philippines, to Mindanao. In the Philippines. So this specific problem in Afghanistan, it represents a generalized problem of occupied Muslim lands. So he then sets about describing this problem and coming up with this ideological solution. And again, there's a lot in my book on Azzam. There's even more in Thomas Heckhammer's masterful new, very long biography of Azzam called The Caravan. Just give a shout out to Thomas on that book. But let me focus on the second bullet point in front of you, because this was this key concept that all jihadis used that were in the AFPAC region back in the 1980s. They would use this phrase, Al-Qaeda sulba, Al-Qaeda sulba, so the solid base or the solid foundation, by which they, including Azzam, meant territory, and specifically Afghanistan. And they were basically arguing and writing and discussing, once Afghanistan is liberated and we have this solid base, what do we do next, right? We can use that solid base to do other things. In the last 2 years of his life, Azam began reconsidering that notion, including in this magazine from April 1988 that you see on your top right, where he writes this article, Al-Qaeda Sulpa, which to my knowledge has not been translated into English, but he makes the case for reinterpretation, and this is really the basis of his global vision of jihad, for what is essentially a jihadi international, which is my phrase, not his. But he went from viewing this idea as a territory to one of creating a pious Muslim warrior class that would travel from place to place, working with local Muslim communities to liberate territory, liberate occupied lands. This is a very similar, why do I call it Jihadi International? It's pretty much the view of the Communist International back in the late teens, 1920s, that was to create not a pious, but an activist warrior class amongst the devoted communists that would travel around Europe primarily to work with local communities to liberate their lands from bourgeois repression. So obviously a different ideological garb, but the concept being essentially the same as the Communist International, so the Jihadi International. So that's the first wave. We can talk more about, when waves start, when they have died. This one died, I date to 1990. Why? Because Azam himself was assassinated in 1989. And then the first attempt to put this Jihadi International into a new area after Afghanistan came with the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in August of 1990, where Osama bin Laden, his colleague in Pakistan, went to the Saudis and said, let's do the Jihadi International. Let's do the Azam model to liberate Kuwait instead of bringing in the Americans. And that was rejected. And so it basically failed its first kind of real world test. So in each of these waves, there are always some true believers that are still out there, but in terms of the sort of wind in the sails, largely evaporated by 1990 in this first wave. Second wave, Americans are very familiar with Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. But notice the crises that launched this wave were very different from occupied Muslim lands around the world. And the specific crises were the looming, and this dates from the mid-90s. I date it to 96, for as Georgia says 95, which is fine. It's in that mid-90s timeframe where jihadi movements, particularly in Egypt and Algeria, that were thought to have, and this is the low intensity conflict in Egypt and the hot civil war in Algeria, that early on in the 90s were thought to probably were going to win in the end. By the mid-90s, it was very clear the state had defeated them. So they were not going to prevail. So how to understand that? And at the same time, following the first Gulf War, you had the growth of, for the first time, a large permanent US military presence on the Arabian Peninsula, and this of great concern to bin Laden as well, who links those two things, the growing, and this is the sort of the generalized problem, why these local apostate regimes are durable, why they can defeat these extremist Islamists and jihadi challenges, and why is it the Americans are expanding their military footprint? Those two things are very much linked. So he then issues, again, there's a number of documents too that I spend time on in the book. One is this 1996 declaration of war, and then more importantly, the 1998 so-called fatwa, religious opinion, which he did not have the credentials to issue. And you see it puts a lot of a newspaper here that announces this, that bin Laden and two of his compadres issue this fatwa to kill Americans fi kull makan, in every place, no distinction between military and civilian. So when I talk about nihilistic violence, keep this call in mind, because this is a great example of nihilistic violence. All right. what did bin Laden add to the sort of jihadi security studies genre? The most important thing is, in my mind, is that second bullet point, where he takes this near enemy, far enemy. Most of you have probably heard of this in the past. He takes this dichotomy, which was invented in the late 70s by the fellow on your screen, Mohammed Abdeslam Faraj, or Farag, an Egyptian jihadi who was in charge of the group that assassinated Anwar Sadat. And he wrote this book, basically to fellow jihadis, short book, Al-Farida Ghaiba, the missing obligation or the hidden duty or the absent duty. It can be translated in different ways, to warn fellow jihadis not to go after the far enemy, which for Faraj was Israel, but to focus your attention and resources on the near enemy, the local apostate regime, in this case, the Sadat regime in Egypt. Bin Laden comes around and flips that on its head, 180 degrees different, and says, Faraj had a good dichotomy here, but he got it wrong. The near enemy will remain durable as long as the far enemy, now for bin Laden, it is the United States, as long as the far enemy is engaged in the Muslim world, on the Arabian Peninsula, in the Middle East, and the broader Muslim world. So the primary objective is to drive the Americans out of the region, break the chain that links Washington with Riyadh or Cairo or elsewhere, and thereby weaken these apostate regimes so that the next time there is a serious challenge to them by, again, extremist Islamists or jihadis, the opposition will win, the near enemy will tumble. All right, that essentially has about a 5-year shelf life, 1998 to 2003 or so, when it was the global jihadi movement of the day. The American invasion of Afghanistan was quite successful at killing off a lot of capturing, and putting on the run a lot of the global jihadi leadership. I finally date the primary end of the second wave to 2011. I talk about some of the franchise and all that, but with bin Laden's killing by U.S. Navy SEALs in Abbottabad, Pakistan in 2011. So the third wave, then, I go into the book, is by far the largest of all the waves. It is the caliphate wave. It is the state building wave. And again, both the crises that prompt this wave and its ideological answer are quite different from the first two waves. In this case, the destruction of the Iraqi state with the American invasion in 2003, and then later on, the crisis of the Syrian civil war in 2011, which gave ISIS a sort of a fresh start after not doing very well earlier on in Iraq. But the general problem, so this is the specific problems in Iraq and Syria, are ruled by what were viewed as Shia or heretical, Rafidun rejectionist regimes in Baghdad and Damascus. So this points to a larger crisis, which again is not occupied territory or driving the Americans out because, to focus on near enemy regimes, but rather apostasy, not apostate regimes, but apostasy itself, sinful behavior. And the notion was to build a puritanical Sharia-based state in the heart of the Middle East, where apostasy itself would not be a temptation, that all those temptations towards sinful behavior would not be part of the landscape. And so Muslims, it's kind of a city of God, city of man distinction, where Muslims could live in a true city of God. In a Sharia state in the heart of the Middle East, and then expanding to other territories beyond that. So there are a lot of ideological innovations I discuss in the book. I put a number of them up on your screen. You can read them. I'll just mention sort of the big one and one other one I think it's very interesting. The big one is the state building enterprise, but not just any state. It is not a Westphalian state in the modern sense of the word, but a pre-Westphalian, pre-1648 vision of a state where no other state has legitimacy. It is the only state in the world that has legitimate. Everything else is essentially an affront to God. So this notion of a pre-Westphalian state in the 21st century is at the core of the analysis. And then one of the other ideological innovations that I talk about is what I call jihadi cool. What anarchists of the late 19th, early 20th century would refer to as propaganda of the deed. Don't get involved in long theological debates with the ulama, with the high-ranking scholars in the Muslim world. Go out and do stuff and let the stuff that you do speak for itself. Let that be the propaganda. And it is really interesting, the kinds of jihadi cool that they engaged in, which again I describe in detail in the book, but also the fact that ISIS didn't spend a lot of time, a little bit of time, yes, but not a lot of time trying to convince senior clerics from around the world of the rightness of their cause. And in fact, at the end of the day, if you look at high-ranking clerics around the Muslim world, not a single one recognized, did the bay'ah, the oath of allegiance to this new caliph, and recognized the caliphate itself. A few low-ranking clerics did, but no senior clerics did, and they didn't. I argue that ISIS didn't really care about that at the end of the day. That was not a pressing issue for them, that this sort of jihadi cool as a recruitment device for young men seeking excitement and meaning in their lives was a much more important venture for ISIS. All right. Let me move on to the current fourth wave here. This begins basically at the same time roughly as the third wave, but it continues to this day. The third wave essentially ends with the destruction of the Dawla Islamiyya, the destruction of the territorial Islamic State in 2017, when both Mosul and Raqqa, and Mosul in northern Iraq, Raqqa in the Euphrates River Valley in Syria, the two prizes of ISIS's possession, both of them fell. And therefore the territorial state no longer existed. This fourth wave, what I call jihad fardey, which I'm just using the word that was coined, or the phrase that was coined by the man on your screen, Abu Musab al-Suri, comes out of the destruction of the Taliban regime, the so-called Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, and then a similar impulse with the destruction of the ISIS caliphate in 2017 by other ideologues. Here, the big crisis was the looming defeat of global jihad itself. Again, quite different from the other three global jihad movements. So how to think through how to basically the movement, for the movement to live to fight another day. How can it survive in the near term, given this destruction that had occurred in the post-2001 invasion of Afghanistan? Jihad fardey literally translates into personal jihad. It's come into English through Mark Sageman as leaderless jihad. But it really means personal, individual attacks. And by jihad, we're talking about jihad as-sayf, the armed jihad of the sword. So the Abu Musab al-Suri is the main, but not the only ideologue of this fourth wave. He wrote this massive 1,600-page internet book. I believe only one, maybe two chapters have been translated into English. You see the Arabic on your screen, Da'wat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyya al-Alamiyya, the call for global Islamic resistance. So what was the global jihad vision here? It was, in a phrase, and this is a phrase he uses, nizam la tanzim. Nizam means, and it's a play on Arabic words because they both come from the same root. Nizam means system, la tanzim, not organization. So how do you create a system, a network system, using 21st century information technology to sustain global jihad, to sustain a movement where it's very easy for groups, for hierarchical organizations to be rolled up by security forces. And he goes over sort of a history of these jihad groups from the early 1960s to show how easy it was for security forces to roll them up. So use of the internet and today social media to create this networked a network of individuals, or what we would call lone wolves, and small groups of like-minded people. I coined this phrase wiki narrative as sort of this. Abu Musab al-Suri uses this phrase thaqafa, which is just a word means culture in Arabic, but he's really referring to a narrative, and a narrative that is communal, that is put together by not one or two or three ideologues, but by thousands of like-minded jihadi ideologues that ever evolves, can incorporate the most recent attack or the most recent news into creating this narrative that at least gives a sense of power disproportionate to its real power, which is set at the end of the day a series of fairly small pinprick attack by individuals in small cells. And I go into stochastic violence, which is this, again, essentially lone wolf attacks, which is the hallmark of the fourth current wave of global jihad. It's also the hallmark of white nationalism, the violent elements of white nationalism today. So I make that comparison explicitly in the book as well. So just in the last couple minutes here, then I asked the question, so where does this fit into the larger universe of violent political movements, primarily non-state movements over the last century or so? And I make the argument that the large majority of violence employed come from, over the last century by non-state actors, come from three sources. They come from Leninist groups, and they come from national liberation, post-World War II national liberation groups in Algeria and elsewhere. In both of those cases, there's a self-vision of basically being based on Enlightenment ideals of the science of history, the unfolding of the scientific progression of history in Leninist groups, liberty, freedom, democracy in the case of national liberation movements in the third world. And I also argue, again, provocatively, that even, and I draw on Sternhell's work here, that even fascism, elements of fascism, the sort of the make the trains run on time parts of fascism are also based on at least elements of Enlightenment ideals of the forward material progress in a conservative hue, of course, but the forward material progress of mankind. We can talk more about that in a minute. So, but there is this small subset of violent political movements that you've seen, again, over the last century. Go forward here. Here we are. Of very violent groups. Generally, they're not particularly important. They don't generally come to power, but are defined by two key characteristics that don't define these other groups. One is nihilistic violence, as I've said, in the political sense, that is system-destroying violence. Again, the anarchists, Russian anarchists of the second half of the 19th century were the ones that began using the word nihilism in a political sense, not in the philosophical meaningless sense, but in a political root and branch system-destroying kind of violence, and have an apocalyptic anti-Enlightenment ideology. And I focus on, as part of this apocalyptic ideology, it's important, this characteristic of cultural contamination. So I coined this word gnosicide, gnosis from the Greek meaning knowledge, the Latin suffix side meaning the killing of. So the killing of knowledge or the killing of those with knowledge. And there's, again, just a handful of these movements, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, the Red Guards in China before Mao took them over beginning in 1966, Boko Haram in Nigeria before it got caught up in the global jihad movement. I talk about the brown shirts in Germany up to 1934 and the Night of the Long Knives, where Hitler got rid of them. But also, when we talk about the Nazi coalition, that cultural contamination element, the anti, what they would often refer to as the cosmopolitan elite, meaning primarily Jews, this was a feature of their ideology, and sociologically, we're talking about semi-literate rural men, primarily as these kind of thugs of the Nazi movement. And I also go over white nationalism today, that elements of the white nationalist movement can also constitute or be seen to constitute a movement of rage. And so global jihad is a variant form. Most of these movements are locally based. This is a global movement or a global vision that has calls for nihilistic violence, that adopts apocalyptic ideologies. Will McCants and others have gone into that issue in some depth. That does have this strong element of cultural contamination, but again, at the global level, not the local national level. And so with that, let me stop my screen share and turn it back over to my friend Jon.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Thanks for that overview. It's a very rich presentation. It's an even richer book. I think the first question I have is to just drill down on differentiating this from other kinds of violent religious movements that we've seen. And you can start arguably with the Kharijites in the early Islamic period. You can work it through the Crusades, a Christian violent movement to conquer the Holy Land. More recently, in the early 20th century, the connections between not only Al Saud and the descendants of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab advancing an ideology, but the Ikhwan, who used violence to communicate the ideology and laid the foundation of the Third Saudi Kingdom. You have Palestinian Islamic Jihad, created in 1981, using violence to liberate Palestine explicitly with an ideological overlay. You have the takeover of the Grand Mosque in Mecca in 1979, Jayman al-Otaibi, with an idea that the leadership is corrupt. So you make an argument that this is really new, starting with Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian who went to Afghanistan. What was really new about it? Was it in the ideology? Was it that we suddenly were able to reach a global audience that you couldn't reach before? I mean, what flipped the switch that this is the first wave?
Right. So great question. And I do talk about that some in the book, that obviously there's been religious violence around forever. I talk about the history of the word jihad itself. So that has been used since early Islamic days by various people in various ways. The switch is flipped in the 1980s when you get the first iteration of a self-understood global jihad, not a local jihad to liberate Palestine or to overthrow a corrupt regime in the case of the 79 mosque takeover in Saudi, which I do actually talk about a bit in the book. So you have lots of local jihad groups for a long time, and before then, at the height of Muslim expansion, calls for what Patricia Crone would refer to as missionary jihad, but which is armed as well. But the key difference, the thing that I'm trying to argue, is only beginning in the 1980s, for the first time, do you have these non-state actors that have an explicitly global agenda that is not linked to a particular regime or a particular patch of land, but as a systemic global problem that stretches across vast patches of the earth.
Thank you. As you look now, you've talked about the fourth wave, and I almost got the sense that you feel the fourth wave is the final wave and that this movement has burned itself out. Is that accurate? Do you think this has gone from a genuinely destabilizing movement to a marginal movement of disaffected individuals?
So to quote a famous American philosopher, it's difficult to make predictions, especially about the future, right? And this is Yogi Berra. And so looking into the crystal ball, I don't see sort of an obvious fifth wave. Why? Because the fourth wave is so tightly married to modern technology, modern information technologies. This is a way that you can survive without easily being rolled up, as has happened in the past. So it's a survival strategy that I think is pretty effective at being durable. So I think we will have this form of global jihad for quite some time. But at the same time, I try and stress not to exaggerate its power, because these are, at the end of the day, these stochastic acts of violence or terror, because they're usually against civilians, will kill people and does kill people. But this is not a existential threat or even a really significant global threat, this fourth wave of global jihad, and it can be contained, managed with sort of traditional elements of law enforcement, intelligence sharing, occasionally maybe special operations, that sort of thing, but not to you need to right size the threat. We've had this tendency to exaggerate it over the last 20 years since 9/11, and maybe we're forgetting all about it now, but to right size the threat.
I know that you completed the book long before the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, because you and I were talking about this event long before the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. The Taliban are now in control. ISIS-K has a serious presence. There is a concern that other groups are going to flow in. As you say, or as Yogi Berra said, it's hard to predict about the future, but do you think you would have come down differently had you realized the Taliban were coming back into power in Afghanistan, had you realized that some of these global jihadis may find sanctuary again in a place that may either be abetted by the government of the Taliban or may be beyond the ability of the government of the Taliban to defend against?
Yeah, and I think that second point is the correct one. Is how much territorial control does the Taliban have? So I don't view the Taliban as a movement of rage. I think there may have been elements there early on, but we're talking about a group that has spent the last 20 years, at the end of the day, defeating the Americans, and so I mean I think it has evolved, and my sense is, and for me, this is a $64,000 question that I would have included in the book as part of the finale there, the epilogue. But has the Taliban learned? Have they engaged in a process of learning over the last 20 years since they were booted out of power? And in particular, have they learned that they can essentially get away with almost anything? I mean, sort of horrible policies towards their own people, as long as they don't allow bad guys, Al-Qaeda and people like that, to set up shop to launch military attacks against other countries. My guess is they have learned that lesson. So there may be individuals. There was intermarriage between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda back in the 1990s. So, that's an issue. And you can bet that the American intelligence and other intelligence are looking at this question very closely. My bet is, and so far so good, the Taliban is not going to just do sort of an open invitation for bad guys to come set up training camps. And as you know, John, there has been blood spilled between ISIS Khorasan, ISIS-K, and the Taliban, and there have been a number of reports that the Taliban is actually working with the Chinese to try and address these security challenges, ISIS-K in particular. So I wouldn't consider the Taliban today a movement of rage, and to the degree that they allow jihadi groups global jihadi groups to set up training camps, I'd be very skeptical that they will do that, but that's something that needs to be monitored without question.
So the last question I want to ask you is, I haven't read a lot of books where somebody spent years trying to grasp a topic and then said, people are just much too fixated on this topic. I've just written a book about it, but the point of my book is you have to scale it down. What did it feel like as you were researching this, as you were presenting some of the findings, to be presenting in some ways the counterintuitive argument that the thing that I'm spending years working out is less important than everybody thinks it is?
Yeah, and it's a great point, because typically somebody writes a book and they want to say how incredibly important this topic is. It's going to dominate people's lives. You just don't know it yet. And I conclude at the end of the book that this is, I use the phrase deadly nuisance, that global jihad as a movement is a murderous, it's a movement of rage, it's a murderous movement, but it frankly doesn't have the capacity to be an existential threat or even a significant strategic threat. It does have some capacity. As I said, you don't want to forget about it either. It does have some capacity to kill people, and it has done that. So yeah, I just thought it was the sort of the honest and right approach to then try and, as I said before, right size the threat. How important is this compared to other threats and kind of foreign policy issues that the United States and other countries face?
But remarkably, as you know, it's one of the few causes that Americans will say foreign policy should act against. I think a lot of Americans are distrustful of foreign policy. They think it doesn't really affect their interest. But the counterterrorism mission has been a mission that has had broad bipartisan support across the country. Why do you think that? Why do you think that is? Why was it such an attractive mission for the government to focus on?
There are a number of theories. People have written about this issue, and there's something to be said. And again, I sort of deal with the statistics of bathtub deaths every year in the United States, try and put in comparison or put in context the number of Americans that are killed by global jihadis over the years. And it is an interesting psychological thing where you can have, 10 times on any given day, 10 times the number of people, number of Americans or Europeans killed by global jihadis, 10 times more than that killed in traffic accidents, or 100 times more. But this is part of what terrorist groups do, right, is to try and capture the imagination and create fear in broader populations. And I think the Americans, have been subject to that to some degree. So just thinking through the topic in a rigorous way, I think you can arrive at, kind of what is the right way to think about this level of threat, and then by comparison to others, don't exaggerate it, don't dismiss it, and then you can come up with the tools that are necessary to address it, I think more readily and more effectively at that point.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes for questions. The first from our audience. The first one I'd like to ask is from our mutual friend, Emil Nachle at the University of New Mexico, who says, as political Islam, both violent and nonviolent, emerged out of a sense of grievance, especially against the near enemy, what impact will the demise of jihadi groups have on political activism under autocracy? If they lose this outlet, then what happens to their grievances?
Hello, Emil. Nice to hear from you. I hope you are well. So I don't think jihadi groups per se are going away. I think a fair argument can be made that they have been weakened fairly substantially. And of course, I'm not writing about most jihadi groups, which most of them are focused on local issues. I'm just delineating those that make global systemic arguments, and both ideological and in terms of the locus of their violence. So let me just sort of call a spade when it comes to Egypt, for example, and just regular jihadi groups, putting aside the global jihadi groups that I deal with. In my judgment, outlawing the Muslim Brotherhood and similar kinds of groups in Egypt is over time will prove to be detrimental to a lot of Egyptians, because it takes away what has historically been a satisficing organization. I mean, to the degree that, you know, a number of people in Egypt have some desire to have some version of an Islamic state, or at least a veneer of an Islamic state, and supporting groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, you know, that are running in elections and that sort of thing, that want to create some version of an Islamic state. This is what I refer to in the book, actually, as a satisficing organization. It is not a gateway drug. I mean, the evidence is pretty strong on the satisficing part of it. I mean, Ayman al-Zawahiri writes an entire book just blasting the Muslim Brotherhood for not taking up arms, for not you know, going down the path of of armed jihad. So if Egyptians don't have that option, if they have that desire, but there's no kind of legal, peaceful way to express it, will some percentage, I mean, then you get sort of the whole exit voice loyalty argument. You will get some percentage that just kind of drop out and don't care, but you'll get some percentage that will fight back. And if the only avenue to fight back is some version of armed jihad, I think that's likely what you'll see more of. And you've already seen that to a large degree, but you'll probably see more of it over the coming 10, 12 years.
Okay. First, we've had a request for your slides. So if you're willing to send our slides, I will do my damnedest to put them up on our website. That sounds like a nod from you. It looks like a nod from you.
No problem.
You have a commitment from me. We will try to get those slides up, and thank you for preparing them. The other, we have several other questions from Jalal Mapar and Patrick Hickey, asking about what you were sort of closing on the issues of how some of the jihadi demands have filtered into politics, have filtered into banking, have filtered into other things. Do you see that as a way of accommodating some of the jihadi demands? Is there a way that having the jihadis on the extreme end has helped Islamize aspects of politics, aspects of social life? Is that something that's good or bad, if it's true?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest that various regimes in Egypt, in Yemen, and elsewhere in the not too distant past have used jihadi threats to get policies and financial backing from foreign actors, including the United States, that they probably would not get, you know, short of that. So, I mean, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, before his death at the hands of the Houthis, his allies, sort of at the time, was famous for pointing out this jihadi threat to the Yemeni regime, getting all kinds of resources from the Americans, including a pretty active, and this is before 2011, 2012, and getting a pretty active special operations assistance in Yemen for the counterterrorism mission, and lots of other resources, while at the same time making sure that the jihadi movement continues to percolate, not really cracking down on it, releasing prisoners from time to time, etc. So there is this kind of, I mean, I think a similar argument can be made when it comes to Nigeria and Boko Haram for a lot of years as well. And I think you've seen that in Egypt. So there's no, in my mind, a very strong argument to be made how regimes have used these local jihad groups as a way to generate resources and friendly policies from the Americans and the Europeans and others. I think that's less true in the case of global jihadis, in the sense that with the exception of the Taliban in the late 90s, Taliban and Al-Qaeda, you don't really have state sponsorship of in any significant way of these global jihadi groups that in a way that you have had and with some of the local jihad groups that can be, I think, sort of more effectively used as this chip to gain resources.
We've had questions from a number of people about the role of states. Some people point to the role of Turkey. There's certainly the role of the United States supporting the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the early 1980s. My friend Jihad says you act as if you frame the rise of jihadis as if they're detached from any states that in more than one way provided fuel for their rise. Have states, have intelligence services seen a utility in engaging with these groups in either destabilizing other places or advancing their own national interests?
And again, I want to make a distinction between the global jihadi groups that I'm looking at and local jihad groups. So there is this example of US support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan in the 1980s, very significant support with Saudi Arabia and Pakistan provided to the Mujahideen, which again was not a global jihad movement. So it's kind of outside. I mean, it's a local jihad against a foreign occupier. So a bit different than sort of the garden variety jihadis that I'm talking about, or I'm sorry, the global jihadis that I'm talking about. There are examples of, and Turkey is a good example when it came to early ISIS issues, and I put Saudi Arabia in that camp as well, that saw ISIS and its predecessors, went through a number of changes, saw them as a useful tool to have in the region. That the Turks, for example, very clearly saw the Kurdish issue as far more dangerous and important than ISIS. And so you did have a history of some Turkish assistance for, again, what became ISIS. That once ISIS declared the caliphate and all of, really kind of hit the big time, then Turkey tended to back off of support at the state level and at the civil society level. Same thing with Saudi Arabia, where you definitely saw resources flow to the early iterations of ISIS that the Saudis interpreted as essentially a useful Sunni group in Iraq that can be, again, useful for Saudi influence in this new regime, new reality in the post-2003 period. You have Pakistan, but again, like with Turkey, once ISIS really hit the big time, I think you saw a significant, basically a cessation of Saudi, both public and private assistance towards ISIS. You can look at the ISI in Pakistan that has essentially they nourished the Taliban and nurtured the Taliban for many, many years, including in exile. Over the last 20 years, they created the and again nurtured Lashkar-e-Taiba as a means, as one tool to attack India with. So there's no question that there have been episodes of state support for general jihadi groups of various types. There's less evidence of that for the global jihadis, with the exception of that early support for ISIS that I just mentioned.
So not to abuse a COVID metaphor, but it almost feels like your description of this global jihadi movement is a mutation in a local jihadi movement, which I think I take implicitly you think is deeply rooted in the Middle East. It has its own set of responses, its own set of sources, not of the same urgent concern to Americans, and that you feel that this has largely been contained as a global phenomenon, but we're likely to still see this state-based jihadi movement supported sometimes by neighboring governments, supported by organized crime, supported by all those kinds of things. So we're not going to see the end of jihad, where we're going to see the end of this apocalyptic, globally embracing jihad, except on the individual level.
Yeah, I think that's
right.
Yes, absolutely. So what you're seeing in the global jihad is a mutation from the extant local jihad groups that are still dominant, frankly. They're still the most important form of armed violence under the banner of jihad in the world today. So I think absolutely right. This was a mutation of that, the local jihad phenomenon that was, again, the intellectual architecture for which was established in the 1960s and early 70s by a number of different ideologues in both the Shia and the Sunni world. This is a mutation only in the Sunni world, incidentally. You've not seen Shia global jihad groups of any significance, and I include Hezbollah in that categorization. So it's, I think, very clearly a mutation. I don't think it's going to end. I think it will peter along and not quite peter out, but as for the time being, it is, I think, a much less important source of violence than local jihad groups that have some of the backers that you just mentioned that make them more durable at the local level.
So let me ask then as a final question about this sectarianism issue, because groups like ISIS have turned from a global focus to now a sectarian focus, not entirely domestic, but sectarian. Ben Leakey from the University of St. Andrews and CSP-TV says, what does the wave approach tell us about the role of sectarianism? This emphasis on sectarianism as a priority, with clear lines to Zarqawi's early dispute with Zawahiri. What does that mean for where this goes and how important it is for Muslim communities around the world?
Yeah, and the interesting thing is extreme sectarianism is not really a part of waves 1, 2, and 4. It's very much a part of the third wave. And I think the reason that you see it, I mean, the sort of extreme, and when I say sectarianism, I mean extreme anti-Shia rhetoric. This is again, the state building model in the heart of the Middle East. The more local, and I think in its early days, you could can make the argument that it wasn't really global. It morphed into a global movement over time, but in its early days, it really wasn't so global in its orientation, and it reflected much more so some of the extreme anti-Shia rhetoric in the neighborhood, particularly on the Arabian Peninsula. And remember, ISIS modeled itself after the first 2 episodes of Saudi state building, which again were extremely anti-Shia, extreme sectarianism. So the interesting thing for me is, I mean, why do you have that extreme sectarianism in the third wave, but also why don't you have it in the other 3 waves?
We are out of time. I am very grateful to my friend Glenn Robinson, author of Global Jihad, A Brief History, one of foreign policy's best books of the year. It is clear, it is understandable, it is comprehensive. Glenn, I appreciate you joining us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John.
Great to see you.